Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about a topic which I've seen all over the place, and it's expressed in a lot of different forms. Perhaps one of the most common is something like, I've seen this so much, atheism is just a lack of belief in God, that's it. And in the context of talking about the implications of atheism. Now, I should preface that when I talk about God in this video, as, well, I always do because I'm Catholic, by God I mean the uncreated creator of all that is, the pure act, the unmoved mover of Aristotle, the good of Plato, the uncontingent source of our contingency, the necessary being in distinction to our contingency, and so on. All these things are descriptions of God, and serve, by the way, as a unique descriptor of God. There's only one uncreated creator of all that is. And so, you see this, and I'm not here, by the way, getting into whether or not atheism is merely the psychological state of lacking a belief, or whether it is actually the act of belief that there is no God. Because either way, even if a person simply merely lacks a belief, there is the proposition that there is a God, in the way I defined, is either true or false. Now, if one doesn't hold that one knows the truth value of this proposition, then one essentially has to face that it may be true and it may be false. Now, if merely lacking this knowledge is nothing but lacking this knowledge, that would imply that the truth or falsity of the proposition that God exists has no implications on anything else in the world. And that's completely false. So here's the thing. Whether one wants to define atheism in its more traditional sense of the disbelief in God, or whether one wants to go with the sort of silliness one sees now about it's a lack of belief in God, either way, to hold that it is nothing more than that is to hold that the alternatives don't have actual real implications elsewhere in life. And it's kind of funny that people believe this because it affects literally everything. But I just want to go over two of the tremendous all-encompassing effects of whether or not God exists. And I'm going to group them basically as epistemology and ontology. That is to say, knowledge and what actually is. So, I'm going to start with knowledge. Now, if God exists, then we are things that have been designed. I can hear the people saying, like, well, what about the sort of like deist idea that doesn't frankly make any sense of, God can be, have nothing to, created the world but has absolutely nothing to do with it. Just sort of started off and then ignored it, and so it proceeded in exactly the same way. And I don't really have time to address this. Probably the place to look for the answer is that creation is not something independent of God. Creation is something that is in every moment dependent on God. You can actually see this in the Aristotelian argument for the unmoved mover. If you know that motion actually means change, not the change in location or local motion. So every single change must be, is dependent on the unmoved mover. And in point of fact, it's not about like the origins back in time. It's actually about like the change from one moment into the next. That change itself must be actualized by something that is purely actual and can't be actualized by something that is itself contingent's the wrong word, but something that is itself changeable. Anyway, because of that, because every moment is immediately dependent upon God, because every moment is dependent on God, God is aware of every moment. Every moment is coming directly from God in an immediate sense. The idea that God somehow started the world and then it has an independent existence and can go on existing independently of God makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. It has nothing to do with God, properly considered. So that whole, sort of deist notion of God doesn't know anything about the world, it's completely and utterly untenable. All right, so that objection swept out of the way, fully answered, and then, its rubble swept out of the way. The question then becomes one of knowledge. We are capable of knowing things precisely because, and I'll grant you, epistemology does depend on ontology, but because we have been created with minds. We have been created with things that are capable of actually knowing what exists. This stands in very great distinction to the undirected evolutionary idea. Now, bear in mind, by the way, evolution itself is something that would be directed, given that every moment is God creating it. And so evolution under the Christian conception is no different than any other way in which God creates things. Creating them slowly is no different than creating them quickly. They're both created according to an idea. God has an intention, is creating us according to some pattern. Telos is the word I'm actually looking for. It means natural end, but in plainer English, it's something like an ideal, a pattern, a design. Now, the alternative in undirected evolution is that we simply are the result of happenstance that happened to... Evolution says so very little if you really take it very seriously. Like the theory of evolution basically states that whatever there tends to be more of, there's usually more of, in a predictive sense. In a retroactive sense, in explaining what has come till now, the theory of evolution basically states that whatever there is more of, there is more of. You can't actually push it further than that if you really, really get down into it. But ignoring that for the moment, because most people do, if you sort of go with something like a survival of the fittest and just sort of put those caveats that it may not happen anyway, and it's dependent upon your environment, and environments change, and so on, and so on, and so on. Roughly, and inaccurately speaking, we have the traits we do because they happen to have helped our ancestors in the environments that our ancestors were in to have produced us. That has nothing to do with necessarily being correct in our cognition. And in point of fact, probably the easiest way to see this is that if God doesn't exist, and yet most people believe in God, this essentially means that evolution has selected against accurate cognition. So if God doesn't exist, you more or less are forced by the simple fact that most people have believed in God and currently believe in God. Most people currently believe in God. Throughout time, most people have believed in God. All the human beings everywhere we can find, basically, almost all of them have believed in God. And so you have to then conclude that accuracy is not, in fact, what our brains are built for. I've seen versions of this where people say, like, well, they're built for accuracy in, like, really small things, but not in the big details. They're built for high accuracy in terms of things like being able to reach over and pick something up and stick it in your mouth. Where the line gets drawn is, of course, something that you're not going to have any evidence for. And worse, because you're the one doing the thinking, you don't know whether or not wherever you draw the line in terms of the accuracy of the human mind is in fact accurate, because that's possibly that drawing that distinction is itself outside of the limits of the accuracy of the human mind. For some odd reason, a lot of atheists will tend to more or less accept themselves from their own theory that, the world is determined, except for me, I'm free. I mean, no one actually says it, but it sort of build this implicitly into their thinking, which gets a little annoying, frankly. It's be a little bit more convenient if people would actually, believe their own beliefs, but, heck, I did an entire video about how no one does that. And if you haven't seen that, no one in a metaphorical sense, not a literal sense. Anyway, so in terms of knowledge, if evolution is completely undirected, there's no reason to believe that accurate cognition is particularly valuable. I mean, for one thing, almost every animal in the world gets by just fine without it, to the degree that we have it, or seem to have it, within the atheistic thing. So, obviously we have more technology than most animals do. So, I mean, whatever our cognition is, it at least seems useful for making technology that works much of the time. And anyone who has a job in technology knows that actually it takes a lot of tries to actually get working technology. So, I mean, it's not like we're good at it in like an absolute sense. It's just, we keep on trying, and we're kind of capable of muddling through and getting some of it to work. Lots and lots of technology never does work. Or attempts to make it never do work. So anything you say within this has to be caveated so much, because essentially none of it's accurate to its own presuppositions. But in any event, under very favorable loose interpretations, you basically get that we don't know how accurate human cognition is, and we also don't know how to determine how accurate human cognition is, because we can't determine whether or not our ability to determine how accurate it is itself within the limits of its accuracy. So human cognition is very, very iffy within an atheistical framework. And by the way, this is not like merely a Christian perspective on it. You can find popular atheists like Scott Adams, who, in point of fact, is a lot of what he talks about is specifically about how human beings are not built for cognitive accuracy, that we're very cognitively defective, that we weave stories in our minds which have some loose association with reality in some parts, and we use those, we don't interact with reality. And so he's part of references a whole bunch of people thinking along these lines, but his whole shtick is about how to manipulate people given this, that when you understand this, how to take advantage of how very inaccurate our cognition is. So the nature of knowledge itself and of thinking about any sort of subject, and bear in mind, he's applying this to politics. And so, his whole political shtick is the wrong word, because I don't mean it in a dismissive sense, but his whole political thing is all about how you have to approach politics with the assumption that human beings aren't rational thinkers, and human beings don't deal with reality. Human beings just deal with what they're evolutionarily predisposed to impose upon reality. And so you have to deal with that. So, this is a very, very practical sort of thing. So this has very far-reaching practical implications. Are human beings capable of reason, or are human beings just fundamentally irrational, and the only thing you can do is manipulate them? Big question, and you get two very different answers, whether you're going the atheistic route or you're going the Christian route to the question of, does God exist? Now, bear in mind, because I get so many of these objections all the time. It's always the same stuff. I can already kind of, almost hear the people who will be watching this video in the future shouting these things. I'm not saying that it is inherent in atheism that you have to believe that that undirected evolution is true, because of course you will find, for example, you'll find certain types of Eastern atheists who believe in the eternal recurrence and whether it's the Wheel of Sorrows or other versions thereof, and who don't believe in this. They don't really believe in God, but they do believe in this eternal universe that constantly repeats itself and so on. Nietzsche did too, and so evolution doesn't really play a role there. However, absolutely none of them believe in accurate cognition either. They just believe in that cognition is not accurate for rather separate reasons. At the same time, if you want to believe that cognition is accurate, there's very good evidence that evolution has taken place. And so if you're going to be an atheist and deny all of it, you've got some interesting problems that you're going to have to face with accurate cognition anyway. All right, so enough for epistemology. To just sort of sum that up, if God exists, then we are capable of reason, we are capable of actually knowing things, because we have been made to know things. And so we have that ability to rationally know. On the other hand, if God does not exist, then you have undirected evolution, which has really no ends, but metaphorically speaking, its own ends, which happen to be something along the lines of reproducing a lot of DNA, for which accurate cognition of a brain, taking place in a brain, is obviously not the optimal strategy, because there are far more beetles than there are us. And I think even in terms of biomass, there are vastly more trees than there are us in terms of biomass, if you want to look at like number of copies of the actual DNA. Whatever metric you want to use, human beings are not at the top for anything except for being, rational and able to impose our will on things. And none of which make any sense within evolution. So unless you're bringing in concepts and thrusting them onto evolution, there are no evolutionary concepts wherein human beings are the most successful species. And so accurate cognition, obviously, at least so far, can't be it. worse, our cognition tends towards believing in God, and so from the atheistic perspective, our cognition has to be inaccurate within evolution. And so what you get to is what H.G. Wells put as he wrote an essay called "Doubts of the Instrument," but essentially you run into some really, really massive problems trying to figure out how accurate your thinking is if you don't know how accurate your thinking is, because of course any step along the way of figuring out how accurate your thinking is might itself be inaccurate. And so what you're left with is fundamentally you can't know how much you can't know things, but how much you can't know you don't even know. So you have essentially no ability to know anything so far as you're aware. Very, very different. Extremely different. And of course, there will be atheists who simply haven't thought this through. The mere fact that people haven't thought things out does not prove that they're particularly rational nor capable of reason. It just means they haven't thought it out. Because that's another one of the objections. You get lots and lots and lots of, like, well, I hold this contradiction in my head, so it's not a contradiction. No, it is. It's a contradiction. You're not proving anything by showing that you believe two contradictory things, and you sure as heck are not proving that you're rational and capable of reason by holding two contradictory things, two mutually exclusive things. Okay, so much for knowledge, epistemology, ontology, or being, what things actually are. Now, I touched upon this for a moment, because it's necessary within to understand epistemology. But within, if God created us, then we are created according to some idea, according to some rational idea. And you get, actually, it's another thing. In order to explain why this has to be the case, because again, I can just about hear the people shouting at the computer screen. How I'm missing something that it's debatably worth the time to go over. But here's the thing. So you have the two alternatives. They are so completely separate worlds that the thing is, if we are rational, then we know that God also is rational in some sense. And I mean, God is unlike us because God is necessary and we're contingent. God is pure actuality and we are changeable and so on. Or potential as well as actual. But at the same time, our rationality has to come from something, and our rationality is not simply a mechanical action that doesn't actually know what it's doing. It's not, when we say good morning, it's not the same thing as when good morning is written on a piece of paper, and you say, well, paper doesn't know what it's doing, even though in some sense it's saying good morning. We have reason, and therefore that reason had to come from somewhere, and since that reason is not a purely material thing, but it is the ability to understand, to grasp things in a spiritual sense, to grasp the forms of things, to grasp, the souls of other things, material souls, animal souls, and so on. That does not have a purely material existence, therefore had to come from God, and therefore God is also rational. And God created us according to a rational idea. That's one entire world that is consistent with itself. The other consistent world is that we're not actually rational. We just think we are. We mistakenly came to the conclusion that we can come to conclusions, but in fact we're just sort of automatons who are going through and saying stuff even though we don't really understand it. We're just conditioned to produce these responses, and one of the responses we're conditioned to produce is that we understand things when in fact we don't, because we're just conditioned to. And then for funsies, let's just change the language and we'll pretend that piece of paper with the word hello written on it is somehow different from us. And yeah, it's a big mess of nonsense. Human language is built upon the concept of rationality. And so when you violate the concept of rationality, none of human language makes sense. But in any event, over on the other side, you get that consistent thing that because we weren't made to be able to rationally understand anything, we don't rationally understand anything. And therefore, since there is no reason, whatever gave rise to the physical universe doesn't have to have given rise to anything but the physical universe, because there's nothing else, because our thinking that we can think is a mistake that, we didn't make. Again, all ways of explaining this accurately are all nonsense. So, should actually tell you something, but in any event, it doesn't inherently have to. And so, So when you go through and you sort of push this, you get two very, very separate worlds. The one in which we're not reasonable and don't have to be reason, and reason doesn't have to exist anywhere because it doesn't actually exist within us, and so on. And the other one where reason does have to exist because it actually does exist within us. And they're just two complete alternative universes, essentially. Furthermore, within this one, we were created according to some rational idea. We have a soul. We have an actual being to us. The physical matter that makes us up is directed towards some end, and therefore is greater than just the mere parts that are within it. There's an entire hierarchy of being in which lesser beings compose together to make greater being. You have all of this. It's a completely different way of looking at the world. It's a completely different world, really speaking. By contrast, within the sort of the atheistic worldview, you get some, and I know there will be atheists who believe in souls and stuff, but again, like if you actually go and look at at what they actually believed in, if you're talking about like Eastern forms of atheism, like the Buddhism of Siddhartha Gautama, his idea of the soul is radically different from ours anyway. And moreover, what's he going to make of the evidence for evolution and so on? Now, anyhow, be that portion as it may, the other worldview, and this is the one that you find dominantly within the West, of this entirely material thing wherein units that compose may have patterns that we are conditioned to be interested in or to find interesting, but those interactions of lesser pieces don't actually make anything new. Nothing's real about their interactions that isn't real about any other interaction. It's just the interactions within a mouse we are inclined to find more interesting than the interactions within a rock, even though, properly speaking, if you actually work it out in physics, if there's more matter in that rock, there are more elementary particles and therefore more actual particle interactions. Remembering that field strengths don't go to zero at distance, they just have very minor effects, but not zero effects, and so they're we're conditioned to only be interested in the larger scale effects, but it's not inherent. And so there are more interactions within a rock than within a mouse. If, from, at the same volume, the rock would be heavier and have more, matter in it and elementary particles and so on, therefore more interactions. We just find the mouse's interactions more interesting, even though there are fewer of them and therefore they're simpler. That's a very different world. And so, and since this video is already really long, all the other things too, are basically just work this out. But you have two very, very separate, completely different worlds. If God exists and if God doesn't exist, you have radically different worlds. And so, and they don't really have much in the way of overlap, even. It's one thing like a lot of people like to think well, we all agree in this. Well, actually, not really. We don't barely agree in anything at all. It's just, we're willing to, we do obviously interact with the same reality, but that's not to say that we agree what it is in any way. And so really, at the end of the day, just sort of, to add one little thing to this, the distinction, this is really what deciding between whether God exists or God doesn't exist, trying to figure out, is which world do we live in? Do we live in the rational world that has natural ends and rationality and reason and will and so on? Or do we live in the purely material world that for some odd reason happens to act like it thinks that it's more than it is, but it's actually just a collection of subatomic particles with no greater meaning than that? They're radically different from each other, and there is no default. There's no this unless it's proven. These are two utterly and completely different things. One of these is not a superset of the other. It's not like, some people believe this and some people believe that, if you can imagine the Venn diagram. It's some people believe this and some people believe that. Which one of these is actually true? And then the thing to do is to look out on the world. They're both complete. They're both complete within each other. They both don't have internal contradictions. The atheistical one doesn't work with normal human language, but whatever. But, nonetheless, within them, they are complete. And so it's not a question of, like, being able to look at them and figure out, like, oh, well, this one simply can't be true. They both, in some sense, can be true. The question is, which one is true? And that's a matter of looking out onto the world and trying to figure out which one of these two worlds do I actually live in? Am I a rational being that can know things? Or is that an illusion and I just act like I do? Again, you can't actually say it in human language. And that's really what the question comes down to. And you can say, I don't know which of these two. That's the agnostic position of, I don't know which of these two worlds we live in, is a perfectly reasonable one. But what's not reasonable is saying that they're not radically different from each other, that it doesn't matter, because literally everything in the world depends on which one of these two things is true. What a lot of people do, just what you tend to see awful lot of, is people act mostly as if they live in this one. Think that they live in this one, but are hedging their bets, acting mostly like they live in this one, except where it's inconvenient, or they just don't want to, or what have you. And then they sort of think that they live in this one a little bit. That's what tends to happen. It's, given that this is actually the world we live in, the Christian world is the one we live in, I mean, it's better that most people aren't so completely wrong, given how utterly bleak the world is if you actually tried to consistently live within the materialist one. And by the way, if you like the Four Horsemen and doubt me, go find the video, maybe I'll track it down and link it, of Daniel Dennett talking about how there's a moral obligation on the part of neuroscientists to not tell people, I think it was neuroscientists, psychologists, something like that. But anyway, of people who know that determinism is true, to not tell people that determinism is true because they will act worse if they believe that they don't have free will. It's hilarious. Anyway, I think on that note, I will say until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.